in Harrow County, Georgia, in the year of our Lord 1883. The air carried more than the heavy stickiness of late summer heat. It was laden with unspoken histories, with the weight of past sorrows too bitter to name, and with the peculiar, almost reverent stillness surrounding one man, Elias Drew. For 18 long years, since the earth had trembled beneath the thunder of a war that promised freedom yet delivered only new burdens, Elias had not spoken a single word. His silence was not the result of injury, nor a vow to any god. It was a deliberate, conscious choice. It was a silence that had grown into legend, a source of equal parts fear and fascination, a canvas upon which the people of Harrow County projected their own anxieties, their private sins, and their whispered truth. What kind of man could bear such a void for nearly 2 decades? What secret could be so heavy, so consuming, that it would seal a man's lips for years on end? And when, finally, that silence was broken, what force could compel him to speak? The answer, when it came, would rattle the quiet foundations of the county itself. Harrow County, in the autumn of 1883, existed suspended between the ghosts of its past and the uncertain shadows of its future. Nearly 20 years had passed since the war ended, yet its scars, both visible and hidden, ran deep, etched into the red clay and the hearts of its people. The grand columned houses of the former plantation elite still stood, though time and neglect had stripped them of their former grandeur. Paint peeled from their facades, timbers groaned under the weight of faded wealth and stubborn pride. The fields, once tilled by the labor of hundreds in chains, now supported a patchwork of sharecroppers and free laborers, black and white, bound less by law than by old debts. Poverty lingered like a patient predator, gnawing at hope and hollowing out lives with quiet persistence. Amid this landscape of quiet desperation moved Elias Drew, a man whose presence was defined by the very absence of his voice. At roughly 45, his body was shaped by years of relentless labor under the unforgiving southern sun, broad shoulders, hands calloused and strong, capable of mending a broken fence or tending a sick animal with equal skill. But it was not his strength that commanded attention. It was the absolute stillness that surrounded him, a calm so complete it seemed to absorb every sound. His skin, dark and rich as the earth itself, bore the lines of age and experience. His eyes, however, were the true windows into a world no one else could enter. Deep-set, sharp, always observing yet revealing nothing. They held the patience of river-worn stone, the quiet wisdom of an ancient oak, and an almost unsettling comprehension of the human heart. Elias lived at the edge of the Voss property in a small, carefully kept cabin, no larger than a single room. Yet the order and quiet dignity of the space mirrored the man who occupied it. His days followed a meticulous rhythm of deliberate action, each motion precise, measured, silent. He rose before dawn, when the first pale light crept over the eastern sky, moving through his morning tasks with the unobtrusive grace of a shadow, a figure at once ordinary and extraordinary in his silence. His breakfast, a simple affair of cornmeal, and whatever meager provisions he could procure, was consumed with the same focused attention he applied to all tasks. Then, with the sun just beginning its ascent, he would walk the familiar path to the main house or the fields, his worn leather boots making barely a whisper on the dusty ground. To the children of Harrow County, Elias was a figure of myth and whispered tales. They would watch him from behind the skirts of their mothers or the legs of their fathers, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. He ain't spoke a word since the war. They'd hear the adults say, their voices hushed, as if the very mention of his silence might summon some unseen force. Some children believed he was cursed, others that he was blessed with a secret language only the animals understood. They would sometimes try to coax a sound from him, calling out his nigh, me, but Elias would merely offer a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes acknowledging their presence before returning to his work. His silence to them was a puzzle, a challenge, and a source of endless unsettling wonder. For the older residents, particularly those who had known him before the war, Elias's silence carried a different weight. Ruth, an elderly woman with skin like crinkled parchment and eyes that had seen too much, often spoke of Elias with a wistful sadness. He used to sing, you know. She'd tell anyone who would listen. Her voice raspy with age, had a voice like a mockingbird, clear and sweet, and he'd talk. Oh, he'd talk about everything he read, about the stars, about the way the river flowed. Smartest boy I ever knew. Her words painted a picture of a different Elias, a vibrant, vocal young man, making his current state all the more profound and tragic. Ruth, more than anyone, understood that Elias's silence was not an absence, but a presence, a monument to something irrevocably lost. To men like Jedediah Finch, the Voss plantation foreman, Elias's silence was a source of constant irritation and simmering suspicion. Jedediah, a man whose cruelty was often expressed in small petty acts of power, found Elias's quiet dignity and affront. He preferred his laborers to be boisterous, or at least compliant and vocal. Elias's unblinking gaze, his refusal to engage in the usual banter or complaints, felt like a judgment. He's always watching. Jedediah would grumble to anyone who would listen, a vein throbbing in his temple. Don't trust a man who don't speak. What's he hiding? Jedediah's fear was not of Elias's physical strength, but of the unknown, of the thoughts that must surely churn behind those silent eyes. He suspected Elias knew too much, saw too much, and that knowledge, unvoiced, was a dangerous thing. Elias's work on the Voss property was varied. He was a skilled laborer, capable of turning his hand to almost any task. He mended fences, cleared fields, tended to the horses in the stable, and sometimes, when the main house required it, he would assist with repairs or heavy lifting. He moved through the grand decaying rooms of the Voss mansion with the same quiet efficiency he displayed in the fields, his presence almost spectral. He was there, yet not there, a part of the household machinery, yet utterly detached. He communicated his needs, or understanding through precise gestures, a nod, a shake of the head, or, when absolutely necessary, by scribbling a few words on a scrap of paper, his handwriting surprisingly elegant and firm. These notes were rare, almost sacred, and always to the point, never wasting a single stroke of the pencil. The year 1883 in rural Georgia was a time of profound social flux. The promise of reconstrained action had largely withered, replaced by a harsh reality of economic subjugation and racial oppression. The black population, though legally free, found themselves ensnared in a new system of debt pomage and Jim Crow laws that sought to reassert white supremacy. The racial tensions were a palpable undercurrent, a constant hum beneath the surface of daily life. Elias, as a formerly enslaved black man, navigated this treacherous landscape with a unique shield, his silence. It rendered him both invisible and hyper-visible. He was often overlooked in conversations, yet his presence was always felt. He was a living testament to the past, a quiet observer of the present, and a silent question mark for the future. His very existence, unvoiced and unyielding, was a quiet act of defiance in a world that demanded conformity and submission. He was Elias Drew, the silent man of Harrow County, and his story, though yet untold, was already deeply etched into the fabric of the land. To understand Elias Drew's profound silence, one had to reach back further than the end of the war, further than the first day he chose to seal his lips. One had to understand the boy he once was, the son of Sarah, a woman whose spirit was as unyielding as the ancient cypress trees that lined the riverbanks of the Voss property. Sarah had been a house servant, a woman of quiet dignity and fierce intelligence, whose hands were skilled in the delicate arts of cooking and healing, and whose mind held a vast repository of stories, songs, and wisdom passed down through generations. She had a way of looking at the world and at her son that suggested a deeper understanding, a recognition of a spark within him that transcended their brutal circumstances. Elias, even as a small boy, possessed a mind that devoured knowledge. He was endlessly curious, asking questions with an intensity that often startled those around him. Sarah, recognizing this hunger, took immense risks to nurture it. In the hushed hours after the main house had settled into sleep, by the flickering light of a stolen candle or the embers of a dying fire, she would teach him. She used whatever she could find. Discarded newspapers, pages torn from old books, even the labels from medicine bottles. She taught him the shapes of letters, the sounds they made, and the magic of stringing them together to form words, then sentences, then entire worlds. Elias, a quick and eager student, absorbed it all. He learned to read with a speed that astonished his mother, and soon he was devouring every scrap of text he could lay his hands on, his mind all light with the possibilities that words offered. His love for writing blossomed alongside his reading. He began to fill small, crudely bound notebooks with his observations, his thoughts, his not poetry. These notebooks, fashioned from scavenged paper and stitched together with thread, became his most prized possessions. In them he recorded the flight of birds, the changing seasons, the quiet conversations he overheard, the injustices he witnessed, and the dreams he dared to harbor. His writing was a secret garden, a sanctuary where his mind could roam free, unfettered by the chains that bound his body. He wrote about the beauty of the natural world, the resilience of his people, and the aching desire for a life beyond the confines of the plantation. These journals were not just records. They were a testament to his spirit, a silent rebellion against the dehumanization of slavery. The specific moment that shattered this vibrant, vocal young man and forged the silent Elias Drew occurred in the tumultuous spring of 1865, as the echoes of the war still rumbled across the land. The Union Army had swept through the region months prior, bringing with it a fleeting taste of freedom, only to recede, leaving behind a vacuum of authority and a surge of desperate, often brutal retaliation from those who clung to the old order. On the Voss plantation, the overseer at the time, a man named Puet, was a figure of particular cruelty. His temper frayed by the collapse of his world and the perceived insolence of the newly freed. Alas, then a young man of 27 had been caught in the fray, elves not shirking work, but rather, in a moment of quiet contemplation, sketching a bird in his journal. Puet, riding by, his face flushed with whiskey and rage, saw the small book. He snatched it from Elias's hands, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the forbidden act of literacy. He flipped through the pages, his sneer growing with each line of Elias's elegant script, each carefully rendered drawing. The words, the thoughts, the very essence of Elias's inner life, laid bare before a man who saw only defiance and a threat to his authority. Puet did not beat Elias that day. The physical scars would have healed. Instead, he chose a more insidious form of torture. He gathered Elias's entire collection of notebooks, the years of observations, the poems, the dreams, the very soul of the young man, and before Elias's horrified, silent gaze, he threw them into a roaring bonfire that had been lit to clear brush. The flames devoured the pages, curling them into black ash, consuming Elias's words, his history, his future. Pute watched Elias's face, expecting tears, expecting pleas, expecting pleas, expecting the breakdown. But Elias, standing there, felt something shift within him. It was not just pain, not just despair, but a profound, chilling realization. His voice, his words, his very thoughts, when expressed, had become a weapon against him, a vulnerability to be exploited and destroyed. In that moment, as the last embers of his written world faded into smoke, Elias made a choice. He would give them nothing. No sound, no word, no expression that could be twisted, mocked, or used against him. He would become an impenetrable fortress. His inner world sealed off. His thoughts his own, forever beyond the reach of men like Put. His silence was not a surrender. It was a declaration of war, a refusal to participate in a system that sought to strip him of his humanity. It was a promise to himself. They would never again take his words from him, because he would never again offer them. The cost of this silence was immense. It meant living in a world where communication was a constant struggle, where misunderstandings were frequent, and where the simplest request became a complex pantomime. It meant enduring the pity of some, the suspicion of others, and the casual cruelty of those who saw his muteness as a sign of weakness or inferiority. It meant carrying the weight of every unvoiced thought, every unshared joy, every unexpressed sorrow. His internal world, once vibrant with spoken words and written prose, became a vast, silent ocean, its depths unfathomable to anyone but himself. Yet his silence also became a unique form of survival. It forced him to become an unparalleled observer. Without the distraction of speech, his other senses sharpened. He noticed the subtle shifts in people's expressions, the nuances in their body language, the unspoken tensions in a room. He heard the inflections in their voices, the hesitations, the lies hidden beneath smooth words. He became a living archive of the Voss property, a silent witness to its daily rhythms, its hidden dramas, its slow decay. Over the 18 years, Elias had developed a complex relationship with his own internal landscape. He still thought in words, in vivid sentences, and intricate narratives, but they remained locked within. He would sometimes trace letters in the dust with his finger, or mouth words silently to himself. When he was alone, a private communion with the language he had so fiercely protected. He still carried a worn leather journal, though its pages were now filled with cryptic symbols, intricate drawings, and sometimes, when the urge was overwhelming, a single, carefully chosen word, written in a hand that had lost none of its elegance. This journal was his new sanctuary, a place where the cost of his silence was both recorded and, paradoxically, eased. His relationship with Ruth deepened over the years. She was one of the few who understood the profound trauma that had led to his silence, though she never spoke of it directly. Their communication was often through shared glances, a knowing nod, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Ruth would sometimes leave him small gifts, a piece of fruit, a mended shirt, acts of silent care that acknowledged his enduring spirit. With Clara Ara Hayes, the young mixed-race cook on the property, Elias found a different kind of connection. Clara, with her gentle nature and perceptive eyes, never treated his silence as a barrier. She would speak to him softly, explaining her requests clearly and waiting patiently for his gestures. She saw past the muteness to the intelligent, kind man beneath. Elias, in turn, felt a quiet fondness for Clara Ara, a protective instinct towards her gentle spirit in a harsh world. He often observed her, noticing her quiet diligence, her occasional worried glances, and the subtle shifts in her demeanor that hinted at troubles she kept to herself. He saw her as a kindred spirit, a quiet observer in her own right, navigating a world that often sought to diminish her. Within the Voss household, Elias's silence was met with varying degrees of acceptance. Harlan Vos, the plantation owner, a man of complex contradictions, treated Elias with a detached respect. He valued Elias's skill and reliability, and perhaps in some unspoken way recognized the man's profound dignity. He never pressed Elias to speak, accepting his muteness as an immutable fact. Eleanor of Voss, Harlan's sharp-minded wife, was more observant. She watched Elias with a quiet intensity, sensing the depth of his thoughts, the keenness of his perceptions. She often wondered what secrets those silent eyes held, what truths he had witnessed in his years of quiet observation. She knew instinctively that Elias's silence was not emptiness, but a vessel overflowing with untold stories. And it was these untold stories, these years of silent witness, that would soon be called upon to bear an unbearable weight. The Voss property, for all its outward appearance of gentle decay, was a crucible of unspoken tensions and hidden minations. Beneath the veneer of southern hospitality and the daily rhythms of plantation life, a web of secrets had been meticulously spun, each thread tightening with the passage of time. Elias, the silent observer, was uniquely positioned to witness its intricate construction, his lack of voice granting him an almost invisible vantage point. At the heart of this clandestine network was Jedediah Finch, the plantation foreman. Jedediah was a man consumed by a gnawing envy for Harlan Voss, a resentment that had festered over years of perceived slights and unfulfilled ambitions. He saw himself as more capable, more deserving than the man whose shadow he perpetually stood in. This envy, coupled with a deep-seated avarice, had led him down a path of systematic embezzlement. For years, Jedediah had been siphoning off funds from the Voss estate, a slow, steady bleed that was gradually weakening the already, yea fragile financial health of the plantation. His methods were crude but effective, relying on Harlan's often distracted nature and Eleanor's preoccupation with the household. Jedediah inflated invoices for supplies, pocketed portions of the crop sales, and manipulated the payroll for the laborers, creating phantom workers or underpaying real ones. He kept a separate clandestine ledger hidden deep within his cabin, where he meticulously recorded his illicit gains, a testament to his meticulous greed. Elias, working in the fields, in the stables, and occasionally within the main house, had observed Jedediah's furtive movements, the way he would linger over ledgers in Harlan's study late at night, the hushed, intense conversations he held with certain suppliers in town, the sudden, inexplicable acquisition of new, expensive items for his own cabin. Elias's eyes, missing nothing, recorded these anomalies, filing them away in the vast, silent archive of his mind. Clara Hayes, the young mixed-race cook, was an unwitting thread in this web. Her duties often brought her into contact with the plantation's accounts. She managed the household's provisions, ordered supplies, and occasionally assisted Eleanor with the more mundane aspects of bookkeeping. It was in this capacity that she began to notice discrepancies. A sack of flour ordered but never delivered, a quantity of sugar that didn't match the consumption rate, a bill for lumber that seemed exorbitant for the repairs actually made. At first she dismissed them as simple errors, common enough in the chaotic accounting of a large, sprawling estate, but as the anomalies accumulated, a pattern began to emerge, a subtle but persistent drain on the household's resources. Clara, with her quiet intelligence, started to connect the dots, her brow furrowing in concern as she realized the implications. She began to voice her concerns, albeit cautiously, to Eleanor Voss. Eleanor, sharp-minded and perceptive, had her own suspicions about Jedediah. She had long found his obsequiousness unsettling, his sudden flashes of temper alarming. Her careful questions about specific invoices or missing supplies resonated with Elena's own unease. Their conversations were often elliptical, a dance around the unspoken truth. Clara would present an invoice, pointing out a discrepancy with a soft, questioning tone, and Eleanor would examine it, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes thoughtful. They never explicitly named Jedediah, but the understanding hung heavy in the air between them. Elias, often working nearby, polishing silver or mending a loose shutter, would observe these exchanges, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions, the tension in their shoulders, the way their voices drop, ped to hushed tones. He saw the fear in Clarara's eyes, the growing resolve in Elena's. The dynamic between Harara was also a peculiar one, and Clara Arara was also a peculiar one. Harlan, for all his flaws, possessed a certain paternalistic fondness for Clarara. She was efficient, respectful, and her cooking was a source of genuine pleasure for him. He saw her as a valuable, if subordinate, member of his household. Clara, in turn, treated Harlan with deference, but also with a quiet dignity that commanded a certain respect. She understood the unspoken rules of their world, but she never allowed herself to be diminished by them. Elias, watching them interact, saw the genuine, if limited, affection Harlan held for Clarara, and the subtle ways Clarara navigated the complexities of her position. He also saw Harlan's increasing detachment from the day-to-day operations of the plantation, his growing reliance on Jedediah, a reliance that was slowly but surely leading him towards ruin. Elias's private journal, the worn leather book he carried everywhere, became the silent repository of these observations, its pages filled not with words, but with intricate sketches, cryptic symbols, and meticulously drawn maps of the property, served as his own personal archive. He would sketch Jedediah's furtive movements, the precise location of a hidden ledger, the worried expression on Clarara's face as she examined. D.A. Bill, the thoughtful frown on Elena's brow. He drew the layout of the study, the placement of the desk, the specific angle of the moonlight through the window on certain nights. Each drawing, each symbol was a coded entry, a piece of a larger puzzle that only he could decipher. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous truths were those that could not be spoken, and therefore must be recorded in a language only he understood. In the weeks leading up to October 17th, the tension on the Voss property became almost unbearable. It was a palpable thing, a low hum beneath the surface of daily life, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm. Jedediah grew increasingly agitated, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He would snap at the laborers, his eyes darting nervously around, as if expecting to be discovered. Clara, too, seemed more withdrawn, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by a quiet anxiety. She spent more time in the kitchen, her movements less fluid, her gaze often distant. Eleanor, for her part, became more watchful, her conversations with Clara more frequent and hushed. She began to scrutinize the plantation accounts with a renewed intensity, her suspicions solidifying into a grim certainty. Elias, moving through this charged atmosphere, felt the tightening of the threads. He saw the fear in Clara's eyes, the desperation in Jedediah's, the growing dread in Eleanor's. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had observed the slow, inevitable creep of disaster for years, that something was about to break. The silence that had been his shield for 18 years now felt like a heavy cloak, muffling the cries he knew were coming, sealing the words he knew would soon be desperately needed. He continued to record, to observe, to file away every detail, every nuance, every unspoken truth, knowing that one day perhaps this silent testimony would be called upon. He just did not know then the terrible price that would be paid for it. The evening of October 17th, 1883, descended upon Harrow County with a deceptive tranquility. The air, still warm from the day sun, carried the faint sweet scent of drying hay and the distant chorus of cicadas. A sliver of the moon, barely a fingernail clipping, hung low in the sky, casting long indistinct shadows that danced with the gentle breeze. Elias, having finished his day's work, mending a section of fence near the far pasture, returned to his cabin as dusk began to paint the western horizon in hues of orange and deep purple. His routine was a comfort, a predictable anchor in an unpredictable world. After a simple supper of stewed beans and cornbread, he would sit on the small rickety porch of his cabin, his worn leather journal resting on his knee. He wouldn't necessarily write, but rather he would observe. He watched the stars emerge one by one in the vast inky canvas above. He listened to the nocturnal symphony of the countryside, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog. It was during these quiet hours that his mind, unburdened by the need for speech, processed the day's observations, weaving them into the intricate tapestry of his understanding. On this particular night, however, the usual tranquility felt subtly disturbed. A faint, almost imperceptible tension seemed to prickle the air. Elias had noticed Jedediah Finch earlier in the day, his face flushed, his movements agitated, arguing heatedly with one of the field hands over a minor infraction. Later he had seen Clara Hayes hurrying from the main house towards the kitchen. Her shoulders hunched, her head bowed, a rare tremor in her usually steady gait. The accusation, therefore, struck the community like a thunderbolt, a cruel and unjust blow. Thorne, accompanied by two hastily deputized white farmers, burst into Josiah's home, their faces grim, their hands already on their pistols. They offered no explanation, no warrant, simply seized Josiah, roughly binding his hands behind his back. Josiah, stunned and bewildered, protested his innocence, his voice calm but firm. "I swear before God I know nothing of this," he declared, his eyes wide with disbelief. But his words fell on deaf ears. He was dragged from his home, past his weeping wife and terrified children, and paraded through the dusty streets of Harrow County, a spectacle of injustice designed to instill fear and reinforce the established order. The white townsfolk watched from their porches with a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction, while the black community looked on with despair, their faces etched with a familiar, helpless anger. The community's reaction was immediate and polarized. For many white residents, Josiah's arrest confirmed their preconceived notions, a convenient narrative that absolved them of any deeper introspection. The murder of a young woman, particularly one of mixed race, was a tragedy, but the swift apprehension of a black suspect offered a comforting sense of order restored. For the black community, however, it was a familiar nightmare. They knew Josiah, knew his character, and understood the insidious machinery of injustice that often targeted their own. Whispers of a rigged trial, of a predetermined outcome, spread through their homes like a chilling wind. Among those who knew the truth, or at least suspected it, was Samuel Davies, a white merchant from town. Samuel was a timid man, prone to anxiety, whose livelihood depended on maintaining good relations with the powerful figures of Harrow County, particularly Harlan Voss, and by extension his foreman, Jedediah. On the night of October 17th, Samuel had been returning home, late, from a business trip to a neighboring county, his wagon laden with goods. He had seen Jedediah Finch riding Bess, galloping furiously away from the Voss property, his face a mask of desperation, his clothes disheveled. Samuel had even exchanged a brief startled glance with Jedediah as their paths crossed on the deserted road. The image had been seared into his memory, a stark contradiction to Jedediah's calm demeanor the following morning. But the fear of Jedediah's wrath, the fear of losing his business, the fear of being drawn into a dangerous entanglement paralyzed him. He kept his mouth shut, his conscience gnawing at him, but his fear proving stronger. Elena Voss, meanwhile, watched the unfolding events with a growing sense of dread and suspicion. She knew Jedediah better than anyone, having observed his character flaws and his simmering resentment for years. Clara Ara's quiet hints about the financial discrepancies, combined with Jedediah's agitated behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and his suspiciously quick accusation of Josiah, all coalesced into a grim certainty in her mind. She tried to speak to Harland, to voice her concerns, to suggest that Jedediah be questioned more thoroughly. But Harland, overwhelmed by the tragedy, and perhaps unwilling to confront the rot within his own detail, household, dismissed her worries as womanly anxieties. He trusted Jedediah, or at least he wanted to trust him, to believe the convenient narrative that spared him further discomfort. His silence in its own way mirrored Elias's, but it was a silence born of denial and a desire for peace, rather than a deliberate act of witness. Deputy Thorne's investigation, if it could be called that, was a perfunctory affair. He interviewed a few field hands, all of whom, under Jedediah's watchful eye, confirmed Josiah's supposed temper or dislike for Clara, vague accusations that served only to bolster the predetermined narrative. He found no weapon, no definitive evidence linking Josiah to the crime, but he didn't look very hard. The pressure to close the case quickly, to present a clear culprit to the agitated white community, was immense. Jedediah, meanwhile, moved through the property with a renewed swagger, his confidence growing with each passing day, his smirk becoming more pronounced. He had successfully diverted suspicion, and he knew it. Elias Drew watched everything unfold with his characteristic stillness, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the despair in Josiah's wife's eyes, the terror in Samuel Davies's furtive glances, the quiet anguish in Elena's face. He saw Jedi's smug satisfaction, and Thorne's clumsy incompetence. He knew the truth, a truth that was being systematically buried under layers of lies and fear. He began to visit Josiah in his cramped, fetid cell in the county jail. The visits were silent affairs, Elias sitting on a rough wooden bench opposite the bars, his gaze steady, unwavering. Josiah, initially despairing, found a strange comfort in Elias's presence. There was no need for words, no need to explain his innocence, for Elias's eyes conveyed a profound understanding, a silent promise of belief. During one of these visits, Elias, with a subtle movement, slipped a small folded piece of paper through the bars. Josiah, his heart pounding, unfolded it carefully. Inside there was no message, no words, but a meticulously drawn sketch. It was a crude but unmistakable map of the Voss property with a specific spot, marked with a small X near the stable. Josiah looked up, his eyes meeting Elias's, and in that silent exchange, a flicker of hope ignited within him. He understood. Elias was telling him where to look, where the truth might be found, if only someone would listen. The trial preparations moved forward with an alarming speed. The jury, predictably, was composed entirely of white men, many of whom had already formed their opinions based on rumor and prejudice. Josiah's appointed defense attorney, a young, inexperienced lawyer from a neighboring town, was clearly out of his depth, intimidated by the local power structure and the prevailing sentiment. Jadia, meanwhile, was a constant presence, whispering in Thorne's ear, conferring with the prosecutor, his influence palpable. Harlanvos remained strangely silent throughout, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He attended the preliminary hearings, his gaze often drifting towards Ellis, as if seeking some unspoken answer. His silence, once a source of strength, now felt like a heavy burden, a complicity in the unfolding injustice. Elias, however, was not silent in his own way. He continued to observe, to record, to prepare. His journal, now filled with even more intricate details, became a silent weapon, a testament to the power of witness. He knew that the truth, once buried, had a way of festering, of poisoning the very ground it lay beneath, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the time was fast approaching when his long-held silence would have to break. Not for himself. Would have to break. Not for himself, but for the innocent man whose life hung in the balance. The courtroom awaited, a stage set for a tragedy, but Elias held a script no one had anticipated. The Harrow County Courthouse. On the morning the trial of Josiah Miller began, was a suffocating crucible of anticipation and oppressive heat. The air inside the small wood-paneled courtroom was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the nervous sweat of anxious spectators. Every bench was packed, a sea of faces predomina, matey white. Their expressions a mixture of grim curiosity, self-righteous indignation, and a few like Ellen Voss, a quiet, desperate hope for justice. The windows, tall and narrow, offered little respite from the late autumn sun, which streamed in, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the heavy air, and casting harsh, unforgiving light on the proceedings. Judge Amos Crane, a man whose jowls sagged with the weight of years, and whose eyes held a weary cynicism, presided from his elevated bench. He was a man who, in theory, believed in the impartial application of the law, but in practice understood the intricate dance of power and prejudice that governed his small corner of Georgia. He rapped his gavel, a sharp crack that momentarily silenced the murmuring crowd, and the trial began. The prosecution, led by a zealous young district attorney, eager to make a name for himself, presented a case built on flimsy circumstantial evidence and character assassination. They painted Josiah Miller as a man of volatile temper, prone to fits of rage, who had harbored a secret resentment against Clara Hayes. Witnesses, mostly white laborers from the Voss property or townsfolk with grudges, were brought forward to testify to Josiah's supposed bad character, or to vague overheard arguments between him and Clara. Their testimonies were often contradictory, riddled with hearsay, and clearly influence, ebbed by Jedediah Finch, who sat at the prosecution table, his presence a constant menacing shadow. Jedediah himself took the stand, his voice smooth and confident, weaving a narrative of Josiah's supposed jealousy and anger, a narrative he had carefully crafted and rehearsed. He spoke of seeing Josiah near the main house on the night of the murder, a blatant lie that went unchallenged. Josiah's defense attorney, a nervous, inexperienced man, named Mr. Sexperienced man, named Mr. Abernathy, was clearly outmatched. He stammered through his cross-examinations, his questions easily deflected by the prosecution's witnesses, his objections often overruled by Judge Crane. He struggled to present a coherent defense, his arguments drowned out by the weight of public opinion and the subtle but pervasive racism of the courtroom. Josiah himself sat stoically at the defense table, his hands clasped, his face a mask of quiet dignity. His eyes, however, held a deep, profound sadness, a resignation to a fate he knew was being unjustly imposed upon him. He occasionally glanced towards Elias, who sat in the very last row, a silent, unmoving sentinel, his gaze fixed on the proceedings with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of the courtroom. The most anticipated testimony came from Samuel Davies, the merchant. Samuel, pale and trembling, was called to the stand. He swore on the Bible, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes darting nervously towards Jedediah Finch, who watched him with a predatory smirk. The prosecutor, knowing Samuel had been on the road that night, pressed him about what he had seen. Samuel stammered, his words catching in his throat. He recounted his journey, the late hour, the deserted road. But when asked if he had seen anyone near the Voss property or anyone riding away from it, his eyes met Jedius, and his courage failed him. "No, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Saw no one. The road was empty. A collective sigh of disappointment rippled through the black section of the gallery, while Jedediah's smirk widened, a silent triumph. Samuel, his testimony concluded, practically fled the stand, his face a mask of shame and relief. Elelena Voss, seated in the front row of the gallery, grew paler with each passing hour. She watched the parade of false witnesses, the inadequate defense, the smug confidence of Jedidiah, and the slow, agonizing march towards an inevitable injustice. Her eyes frequently sought out Harlan, who sat beside her, his face grim, his silence as profound as Elias's, though born of a different kind of burden. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his loyalty to Jedidiah and his dawning realization of the truth. But he remained silent, paralyzed by indecision and the fear of scandal. The trial dragged on for 3 excruciating days. The prosecution rested its case, confident in its victory. Mr. Abernathy, Josiah's lawyer, made a weak closing argument, his voice lacking conviction, his words failing to sway a jury whose minds were already made up. Judge Crane began to prepare his instructions to the jury, his voice droning, the outcome seemingly sealed. It was then, in that moment of crushing inevitability, that a subtle shift occurred in the back of the courtroom. Elias Drew, who had sat motionless for 3 days, a silent, almost invisible presence, slowly, deliberately began to rise. His movement was so unexpected, so utterly unprecedented, that it drew every eye in the room. A hush fell deeper and more profound than any gavel could command. People craned their necks, whispering, wondering what this silent man could possibly be doing. Judge Crane, startled by the sudden commotion, paused his instructions, his gaze falling upon Elias. "Mr. Drew," he said, his voice tinged with surprise, "do you have business before this court?" Elias simply stood, his tall frame erect, his eyes usually so guarded, now burning with an intense, unwavering light. He did not speak, he did not gesture. He simply stood there, a silent challenge to the entire proceeding. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Jedediah Finch, his smirk suddenly vanished, stared at Elias with a look of dawning horror. Harl N. Voss, his eyes wide, leaned forward, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps dread crossing his face. Eleanor Voss, however, watched Elias with a sudden fierce hope, a recognition of something profound about to unfold. The silence in the courtroom became absolute, heavier than any sound, more potent than any spoken word. It was the silence of 18 years, finally poised on the precipice of breaking. Every breath was held, every eye fixed on the silent man. And then Elias Drew, the man who had not uttered a single sound for nearly 2 decades, opened his mouth, a low, guttural sound, like a stone grinding against stone, escaped his lips, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the courtroom. It was a cough, a clearing of a throat long unused, a prelude to the impossible. The room went absolutely still, the air thick with disbelief, as Elias Drew prepared to speak. The sound, a rough, rasping cough, was like a thunderclap in the absolute stillness of the courtroom. It was a sound so unexpected, so utterly alien coming from Elias Drew, that it sent a shiver through every person present. Judge Crane, his face a mask of astonishment, leaned forward, his gavel forgotten. Jedediah Finch, his eyes wide with a sudden chilling dread, half rose from his seat, his hand gripping the table. Harlan Voss stared, his mouth slightly agape, as if witnessing a miracle or a nightmare. Eleanor Voss, however, closed her eyes for a brief moment, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, a silent prayer of hope. Elias, his throat clearing, took a deep, shuddering breath. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, a growly whisper at first, unused to the air, but it was clear, deliberate, and carried an authority that silenced every other sound in the room. I waited, Elias began, his voice gaining strength with each word. I waited until someone was finally willing to listen. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The words, simple yet profound, hung in the air, laden with the weight of 18 years of silence. Judge Crane, recovering his composure, pounded his gavel. Order, order in this court. Mr. Drew, if you have testimony, you must approach the stand. Elias, with a slow, deliberate pace, walked towards the witness stand. Every eye followed him, every breath held. He raised his hand, took the oath, his voice, though still rough, firm and unwavering. My name is Elias Drew. I have lived on the Voss property for 45 years. I have seen much. I have heard much. And I have remembered everything. He turned his gaze directly to Jedediah Finch, who visibly flinched, his face draining of color. Jedediah Finch, Elias stated, his voice resonating with a quiet power, has systematically embezzled from Harlan Voss for the past 7 years. The courtroom erupted. Nay, a cacophony of shouts and gasps. Jedediah sprang to his feet, screaming, "Lies! He's a mute. He's mad. He can't speak." Judge Crane hammered his gavel repeatedly. "Silence, Mr. Finch." Another outburst, and I will hold you in contempt. Mr. Drew, you may continue. Elias, unperturbed by the outburst, continued, his voice now a steady, measured cadence, each word a hammer blow of truth. He began with small amounts, inflating invoices for feed and seed. On April 12, 1876, he charged for 20 sacks of cornmeal, but only 15 were delivered. The ledger will show this discrepancy. On October 3, 1878, he sold 3 bales of cotton to Mr. Silas Thorne in Wayross, but only reported 2 to Mr. Voss. I saw the transaction. I saw the payment. He spoke with the precision of an accountant, rattling off dates, specific amounts, names of suppliers, and the exact nature of the fraudulent transactions. He described Jedediah's methods, the way he manipulated the payroll, creating phantom names, pocketing the wages of non-existent laborers. He detailed the specific ledger pages where these discrepancies could be found, the subtle alterations Jedediah had made to the figures. The prosecutor, initially skeptical, began to scribble furiously, his eyes wide with dawning realization. He kept a separate ledger. Elias continued, his gaze still fixed on Jedediah, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in H, his cabin under the bed, wrapped in an oilcloth. It contains the true accounts of his theft. Jedediah, now slumped in his chair, his face ashen, looked like a man who had seen a ghost. His carefully constructed world of lies was crumbling around him, brick by painstaking brick. Elias then shifted his testimony to the web of secrets he had observed within the Voss household. Clara Hayes, he said, his voice softening slightly, discovered these discrepancies. She spoke to Mrs. Voss subtly, carefully about the missing supplies, the inflated bills. I saw their conversations in the kitchen by the pantry door. Mrs. Voss. He nodded towards Elena, who sat transfixed, began to investigate, to scrutinize the accounts. He described specific conversations he had witnessed through open windows or while working quietly in the background. He recounted snippets of arguments between Jedediah and Clara Rara, hushed, tense exchanges where Clara Rara's voice, though soft, carried a note of defiance, and Jedediah's was laced with menace. He described the body language, the expressions, the fear in Clarara's eyes, the desperation in Jedidiah's. It was as if he had been present in every room, a silent, invisible scribe recording every word, every gesture. Finally, Elias turned to the night of October 17th. The courtroom held its breath. On the night Clara Arara Hayes died, he began, his voice now firm, unwave. Ring. I was on my porch. I saw the light in Mr. Voss's study. I heard voices. Jedediah Finch and Clara Hayes were arguing. I saw their shadows through the window. Jedediah was agitated. Clara Ara was pleading. He described the sharp sound like something breaking, followed by the stifled cry. Jedediah emerged from the back door of the main house. Moving with great haste, he went directly to the stable. He saddled Bess, Mr. Voss's mare, a dappled grey, with a white blaze and 3 white socks. He rode away towards town at a gallop. I noted the time. It was just past midnight. He then looked directly at Samuel Davies, who sat in the gallery, his face now a mask of terror. Samuel Davies, Elias stated, was returning from Wayross that night. He saw Jedediah Finch on Bess on the road leading from the Voss property just outside of town. Their paths crossed. They exchanged glances. Samuel Davies, unable to bear the weight of Elias's gaze and the undeniable truth, let out a choked sob and buried his face in his hands. The courtroom was in an uproar. Jedediah Finch, his face now a ghastly shade of green, began to tremble violently. He tried to speak, but only a strangled gurgle escaped his lips. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed onto the floor. A broken man. Judge Crane, his own composure shaken, called for order, but it was a futile effort. The truth unleashed after 8 years of silence had shattered the carefully constructed facade of Harrow County. I have kept a record, Elias said, his voice cutting through the den, of everything I have seen, everything I have heard for 18 years. With a deliberate movement, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and produced his leather-bound journal. It was old, its cover scuffed, its pages yellowed, but it was intact. He handed it to the bailiff, who, with trembling hands, passed it to the judge. Judge Crane opened the journal. Its pages were not filled with words. But pages were not filled with words, but with intricate, meticulous drawings, sketches of Jedediah poring over ledgers, maps of the property with specific locations marked, detailed depictions of Bess, the mayor, being written away in the dead of night. Even a crude but unmistakable drawing of Jedediah's hidden ledger beneath a floorboard. There were symbols, too, a complex code that Elias had developed over the years, each one representing a date, a time, an event. It was a silent visual testimony, a chronicle of a hidden world, painstakingly recorded by a man who had chosen silence as his most potent weapon. The judge, his eyes wide with disbelief and awe, began to read aloud some of the entries, translating the symbols and drawings into a chilling narrative of theft, deceit, and ultimately murder. The courtroom listened in stunned silence, the weight of Elias's 18 years of observation pressing down on them. The truth, undeniable and irrefutable, had finally found its voice, and it was a voice that had been waiting patiently for its moment to speak. The aftermath of Elias Drew's testimony was a maelstrom that ripped through the quiet complacency of Harrow County. Jedediah Finch, revived from his collapse, was immediately taken into custody, confronted with Elias's meticulous, irrefutable evidence, and the sudden, overwhelming weight of his own guilt. He broke his confession, a rambling, tearful admission of embezzlement and the desperate act of murder to silence Clara Hayes, confirmed every detail Elias had spoken. He admitted to striking Clara Rara in a fit of rage when she threatened to expose his theft to Harran, and then fleeing on Bess, hoping to create an alibi in a neighboring town before returning to feign shock. The mayor, he confessed, had been left tied in a secluded grove outside town, only to be retrieved before dawn. Josiah Miller, the wrong man, was released from his cell that very evening. His reunion with his wife and children was a scene of profound, tearful relief, a small beacon of justice in a world often devoid of it. The black community of Harrow County, who had gathered outside the courthouse in silent vigil, erupted in cheers and hymns of praise, their voices echoing the triumph of truth over injustice. Josiah, his eyes still, bearing the marks of his ordeal, sought out Elias, grasping his hand firmly. No words were exchanged, but the gratitude in Josiah's gaze spoke volumes. Elias simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgment of the burden shared and the duty fulfilled. The community of Harrow County, both black and white, was forced into a reckoning. The trial had laid bare not only Jedediah's crimes, but also the systemic failures, the prejudices, and the convenient blindness that had allowed an innocent man to be condemned. Deputy Thorne, his incompetence exposed, was quietly removed from his post, his reputation in tatters. Samuel Davies, his conscience finally clear, came forward to corroborate Elias's account of seeing Jedediah on the road, his testimony now imbued with a newfound courage. Eleanor Voss, her face etched with a mixture of sorrow and profound relief, sought out Elias the day after the trial. She found him in his cabin, sitting on his porch, the worn journal open on his knee. She sat beside him, the silence between them now comfortable, understanding. "Elias," she began, her voice soft, I don't know how to thank you. You saved an innocent man. You brought truth to light." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "And you carried such a burden for so long. Why did you wait?" Elias looked at her, his eyes holding the wisdom of ages. He reached for a small piece of paper and a pencil, his mauve mane. Nat's deliberate. He wrote a single sentence, his elegant script flowing across the page. "They would not have believed me then. They would not have listened." He handed her the note. Eleanor read it, her eyes welling up. She understood. His silence had not been a weakness, but a strategic patience, a profound understanding of the world he inhabited, a world that would only listen when the evidence was so overwhelming, so meticulously documented that it could no longer be denied. "You are a remarkable man," Elias drew. She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Harlan Voss, however, found himself in a more complicated position. The revelation of Jedediah's betrayal, coupled with the public scandal, shattered his world. He was forced to confront his own blindness, his over-reliance on a man who had systematically defrauded him, and his initial dismissal of Eleanor's and Clara Rara's concerns. The Voss property, already struggling, faced an uncertain future. Harlan, a man of pride and tradition, was humbled. He sought out Elias, not with gratitude, but with a profound, almost desperate need for understanding. He stood before Elias, a man broken by years of unspoken truths, his voice trembling. "Aias," he said, "all these years you knew. Why didn't you? Why didn't you tell me?" Aias met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Slowly, he picked up his pencil and wrote, You did not ask the right questions, Mr. Voss, and you were not ready for the answers. Harlan read the words, and a deep, almost aching sadness settled across his face. In that moment, he understood something profound. Elias's silence had not been mere stubbornness or fear. It had been a mirror, reflecting back the truths Harlan himself had long avoided seeing. In time, the Voss property would be sold in fragments. The grand house, once a symbol of wealth and pride, would crumble further into disrepair, a monument to an era that could no longer support itself. Harlan and Eleanor would move into a smaller home in town, their lives forever altered by the weight of the revelations they had finally faced. And Elias Drew, the man who had carried 18 years of silence, discovered a new freedom. No longer just a laborer or a shadow at the edge of the county, he had become a legend, a quiet emblem of resilience and profound truth. He continued his routines in the small cabin he called home, each action deliberate, precise, unchanged in outward form. Yet the burden he had carried for nearly 2 decades had lifted. The community, black and white alike, now regarded him with respect, a reverent, hushed acknowledgement of the strength it took to bear such silence. They had glimpsed the power in restraint, the wisdom in measured truth. Months later, on a cool late autumn evening, Elias sat on his porch. A new journal rested on his knee, its pages pristine, waiting. He held a pencil, its tip hovering above the blank paper. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth drifted through the air, mingling with the faint chorus of cicadas as the first stars pricked the darkening sky. He gazed at the empty page, then out across the vast, silent landscape of Harrow County, a land that had witnessed much and now, finally, knew a measure of truth. He did not write, not yet. Perhaps he would, perhaps he would not. The choice belonged to him now more than ever. His silence had preserved not only the truth of a long-buried crime, but the integrity of his own spirit, the sanctity of his thoughts. He had spoken when it mattered most, and in doing so, had earned the right to his quiet, profound peace. The secrets he still carried, the insights that filled his mind, were his alone to keep or to share, on his own terms. The man who had refused to speak for 18 years had found his voice, and in that voice he had redefined what silence could truly mean.